What is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. It's a language used to describe the presentation of a web page written in HTML. Think of HTML as the blueprint of your website, outlining the structure, while CSS is the interior design, bringing color and style to the space. CSS helps you control your HTML elements' color, font, size, spacing, and positioning, making your web pages visually appealing. Let's look at the basic syntax of CSS. It consists of selectors and declarations. Within the declaration, we have the style property name and value. Selectors target the HTML elements you want to style. There are different ways to apply CSS: inline CSS, internal CSS, and external CSS. Now let's take a look at simple HTML file. Here we have h1 element and multiple paragraph elements. We'll apply CSS to these elements to style them. Let's take a look at what we mean by inline CSS. Inline CSS simply means we'll use a style attribute on each element we want to apply styling to. Now let's add some styling properties to the header element h1, like the color that will be blue, and set a font size to 20 pixels. This will make the content of h1 element of the color blue and font size 20 pixels. Similarly, we'll add styling properties to the paragraph element and set the color to gray and font size to 10 pixels. This will make the content of the P element of color gray and font size 10 pixels. As you can see here, the CSS will be applied to only those elements that have the styling properties. Now let's say you want to apply the paragraph styles to all the paragraphs on the page. In that case, you would have to copy and paste these style properties and add them to the style attribute of each of these paragraph elements. As you can imagine, the CSS applied to the paragraph element is redundant and difficult to maintain as the HTML page grows. This method is good for small-scale styling or when you want to apply unique styling to a particular element. A lot of these problems can be solved using the next method, that is internal CSS. It involves adding a style tag in the HTML page within the head element tag. Let's add some CSS styling by targeting some of the HTML elements using selectors. With this method, we no longer need to use the style attribute on the HTML elements. Let's move the style properties from the style attribute of h1 element and target it using the h1 CSS selector. Similarly, we'll do the same for the paragraph elements and target it using the p CSS selector. This method works well when you have a single HTML page. But let's say you have multiple HTML pages that need to be styled. In that case, this method is not scalable as you would have to copy-paste these styles into each of the HTML pages. To mitigate this, we'll use the third method, that is external CSS, where we create a separate CSS file. Now let's create a style.css file and import it into our HTML page. Create a link tag in the head section and link it to our CSS file. Let's save these and see the changes in the browser. Great. Now let's talk about the box model. Understanding the box model is crucial for layout and design. Every HTML element is essentially a box. It consists of 4 parts: content, padding, border, and margin. Let's see this in action. We'll add some box model properties to our styles.css. Here, we have added a border around with padding inside the border and margin outside it. Notice how these properties affect the spacing and layout of our element. Let's take a close look at CSS selectors. CSS offers a variety of selectors to target elements. Besides the basic selector we used earlier, where we target elements by their element names like h1, p, etc., we also have class selectors, ID selectors, and more complex ones like attribute selectors and pseudo-classes. Let's enhance our HTML to demonstrate these selectors. As you can see here, we have a header element, a bunch of paragraph elements, a span element, and an anchor element as well. We have added a few attributes to the paragraph elements like the class, ID, and the data attribute. Now let's look at how we can style these elements using different selectors. The first one is the type selector. This selector targets all elements of a given type. For example, all the paragraph tags can be targeted using the p CSS selector. The next one is the class selector. This selector targets elements with a specific class. Classes are usable and can be applied to multiple elements. In this case, these styling properties will be applied to all the elements that have a class attribute intro. The next is the ID selector. This selector targets an element with a specific ID. IDs are unique and should only be used once per page. In this case, this styling will be applied to the elements that have an ID special. The next one is the attribute selector. This selector targets elements based on the presence or value of an attribute. In this case, we are targeting a paragraph element that has a data attribute info with the value extra. The next one is the pseudo-class selector. Pseudo-classes target elements based on their state or position, like when they are hovered over. In this case, we are targeting an anchor tag, specifically when that anchor tag is on hover. The last one is the pseudo-element selector. Pseudo-elements target specific parts of an element, like the first line, the first letter, or the content before or after an element. In this case, we are targeting the first line of a paragraph and changing the font weight to bold. We are also targeting the content that comes before the span tag. Here with the content property, we are adding two angle brackets that will appear before the span tag. As you can see, these selectors allow you to target and style your elements in very specific ways, giving you a lot of control over your page's design. Now let's talk about CSS specificity. Specificity determines which styles are applied when multiple styles could apply to the same element. Think of it as a scoring system. The higher the specificity, the more important the rule is. Here's how it works. An ID selector, in this case special, has higher specificity than a class selector intro. A class selector has higher specificity than a type selector, like P or H1. Inline styles have the highest specificity. Let's see an example. Here's some CSS where specificity comes into play. In our HTML, the P element with the class intro and the ID special will have the red color because the ID selector has the highest specificity. Even though it matches the P tag and the intro class, the ID selector overrides both. Now if we apply inline styles using the style tag and change the color to green, then the inline style will override any other CSS that was applied, even the ID selector, and update the content to color green. Moving on to layout techniques, CSS offers several ways to lay out your elements, including float, Flexbox, and Grid. Let's start with Flexbox, which is great for creating responsive layouts. Here's an example of using Flexbox. We'll update our HTML and CSS files. As you can see here, we have a parent div with class container and child divs with class box. Here we set the container to display flex and use justify content space around to evenly distribute the space between the boxes. Flexbox makes it easy to create complex layouts with minimal code. Now let's look at CSS Grid, which provides a more powerful way to create layouts. It's especially useful for creating two-dimensional layouts. Here's how you can use CSS Grid. As you can see here, we have a parent div with class grid container and child elements with class grid item. We'll set the display property to grid for the grid container and also provide a grid template columns property. This will define a grid with two equal width columns. FR here is a fractional unit and one FR is for one part of the operable space. The gap property will add a 10 pixel space between the grid items. Lastly, let's talk about responsive design. With more users accessing websites on various devices like phones, tablets, laptops, and desktops, it's crucial to make your site look good on all screen sizes. Media queries are a key tool for this. Here's a simple example of a media query. As you can see here, we have the container div whose display property is set to flex. We have also specified a flex direction of column. This will render all the items within the container in a column format. Then comes the media query that changes the flex direction from column to row when the viewport width is at least 600 pixels, making the layout responsive. And that's a wrap. We have covered the basics of CSS, from syntax and selectors to the box model, layout techniques like Flexbox and Grid, and lastly, responsive design. Remember, practice is key to mastering CSS, so keep experimenting with these concepts in your own projects. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who can benefit from it. Hit the bell icon to stay updated with our latest web dev content. Happy coding and see you in the next one. Peace.